Let's talk about sensors. This is a variety of the sensors that we have to use. There are two different ways that sensors work. I'm going to explain the differences in the two ways. This is a touch sensor. This is an infrared obstacle sensor. This is a digital tilt sensor. This is a pressure sensor. This is a temperature sensor, a sound sensor, and a solar panel. The pressure sensor, sound sensor, temperature sensor, and solar panel all work in one way. The digital tilt, the infrared obstacle sensor, and the touch sensor all work in another way. These three sensors are either on or off. So a touch sensor either touches something or it's not. It's either touching something or it's not. An infrared obstacle sensor is either detecting an obstacle or it's not. It's either detecting an obstacle or it's not. The tilt sensor, you can hear there's a little ball in it, and there's a little metal ball in there. And what happens when it tilts is that it makes a connection. So it's either making a connection or it's not making a connection. It's making a connection or it's not making a connection. The digital tilt sensor can also be used like a vibration sensor. Notice that all of the sensors that look like this have 3 wires coming out of it. The 3 wires are labeled on the sensor what it is. So if we take the touch sensor, for example, and we look closely at the touch sensor, you'll notice that it is labeled GND, which stands for ground or negative. So the wire coming out of that pin needs to be connected to ground. Then next to it is VCC, which stands for voltage constant current. So that needs to be connected to the positive side of the breadboard or the 5 volts. And SIG, S-I-G, some of them say OUT for out. Same thing. So this sound sensor says OUT for out. The SIG is the signal. It's what's sending information to the Arduino. So that needs to be connected to a pin. Since the infrared obstacle sensor, the touch sensor, and the digital tilt sensor all work in the same way, I'm going to show you how they work using just the touch sensor, and then understand that you can replace either the infrared obstacle sensor or the digital tilt sensor for the touch sensor if that's what you wanted. One thing I want you to note is that the infrared obstacle sensor has this tiny little screw. If you get a screwdriver and you turn this, it changes the distance of something that it's detecting. So if you turn it one way, it'll detect something that's close. If you turn it the other way, it'll only detect things at a further distance. So you can play with that screw to determine how far or close you want something to be detecting. Now, for the touch sensor, remember, the GND is for ground. So I'm going to take my wire that's coming out of the GND and I'm going to plug it into the negative side of my breadboard because that's what's connected to ground. I'm then going to look at the second label and it says VCC. So I'm going to plug the positive, that VCC wire, into the positive side of my breadboard. Now my third wire is the signal. And this needs to go to an analog pin. So on the other side of your Arduino board are the analog pins. They're A0 through A5. So you're going to plug in your touch sensor, the last wire that says signal, into your analog pin. And when you do that, you'll notice that the light lights up. Just so you see, when I touch the touch sensor, the LED light goes on. When I let go of the touch sensor, the LED light goes off.
To insert a pressure sensor or a flux sensor, all you need is a jumper wire and a resistor. So when you hold both of these sensors face up, there is a left node and a right node. The left node is negative, so you want to connect that to a resistor, which will be connected to ground. So I'm going to insert this. Make sure you leave enough space to insert the resistor and also a jumper wire. So I'm going to connect the resistor to ground. And then I'm going to connect a jumper wire from that negative node to an analog pin. I'm going to put it to A0. And then you want to connect the positive node with a jumper wire to 5V. When inserting a solar panel, all you need is 2 jumper wires. You'll notice that on a solar panel there is a red and black wire followed with a red and black clip. You want to connect 1 jumper wire to each of these clips. You want to connect the jumper wire that is connected to the red clip of the solar panel to the positive side of your breadboard. And you want to connect the jumper wire that is connected to the black clip of your solar panel to the negative side of your breadboard. Okay, so we are back in ardublocks, and today we are going to be learning how to code sensors. So as always, we want to start off with a loop. So we go into control, the control tab on the left side, and drag out the loop do block. And so since we're using sensors, we need a place to store the values that the sensors are getting. And the best way to do that is through a variable. So to make a variable, we need to get the set number variable block, which is under the numbers and constants tab on the left. So it's this red block over here. So just drag it into the loop and you're good to go. But when you're making a variable, there are 2 things you have to consider: the name of the variable and the value of the variable. So the name of the variable is easy. In this case, you want to name it after what your sensor is. So it could be tilt sensor, solar panel, touch sensor, whatever your sensor is. In this case, I'm just going to name it sensor. And we also have to consider what the value of this variable is. And so in this case, we want the value of the variable to be all the numbers that the sensor is receiving, all the values that the sensor is receiving. And the way to do that is to change the value here of this variable to the analog pin that the sensor was originally plugged into. That way, the variable is always going to be changing because it's going to correspond with what values the sensor is receiving. So I'm just going to get rid of this 0 over here, go into pins, get the analog pin number block, and change the number here to whatever pin your sensor was plugged into. In our case, we plugged in our touch sensor into A1, the first analog pin, so I actually don't have to change this, but if you plugged it into the A3 pin, for example, you need to change this to 3. And so after that, the last thing we want to do is just to print all the values that the sensor is receiving. So the best way to do that is use the serial println block, which can be found under the utilities tab. You want to just drag that under the set number variable block, and then we want to get the analog number 1 block. So we want to go into pin and drag that in. But we encounter an issue. These blocks aren't connecting. The way we fix that is we just get rid of this little message here, go into numbers and constants, and get a glue block. And so the best one that we want to use for this situation is the one with the rectangular end and the one that's kind of angular here. So we would drag that in, and then we'd be able to connect these 2 blocks. And so there you have it. So this code should work, and it should basically just print the numbers that are being generated with the sensor. And you should either expect to be getting a range of numbers or that you're just getting 2 numbers, low and high. So the next step is just to think about what you're going to do with these numbers. What do you want to do with your output?